Change, inspired by the words of Mahatma Gandhi, who lived for peace and not violence.
Boom, shakalaka. Ladies and gentlemen, freaks and geeks, brothers and sisters around the world, it is I, Chris Yule, your chocolate Nubian soul brother. I love saying that. Chocolate Nubian soul brother. It has a ring to it, doesn't it? But that is how I see myself. First and foremost, I'm a chocolate man. No. First and foremost, I am a child of the universe. I'm a manifestation of consciousness. I'm connected to all that is, all that was, and all that ever will be. I believe in the concept of the universe, the one verse from Uni 1 and Vasari, change, the constant change, the infinite, this idea that we are all part of something that is ever emerging, this efflorescence of consciousness, this efflorescence of matriculation to higher levels of understanding, this centropic force that is constantly growing, that may often seem as if it is devolving, but eventually will manifest into its full potential. Damn, I'm good, aren't I? But first and foremost, I absolutely look at myself as a manifestation of the universe, and then as a human being, and then as an animal. I think we are all animals, human, non-human, and then, of course, as an African or an Australian, but that doesn't matter. We can go into all these different groups, but I find more often than not, people want to classify themselves first and foremost as belonging to a group. Classify themselves as a black man, classify themselves as a white man, as an Australian, as an American, as a Chinese. And I find that the more that you are inclined to define yourself as a group, the more trouble you get into. One of the things that I've been meaning to talk about lately is the whole concept of group justice, social justice, which is a topic that I think a lot of people have strong opinions on, understandably. And my opinions have changed, not so much because my ideology has changed. I mean, I like to think of myself as not having an ideology, but I think to some extent we all have an ideology. But my view has changed on the topic of social justice because the way in which I would define social justice in the past was social justice was a concept where we were talking about justice for all. Justice not just for white people, black people, Chinese people. Justice not just for human beings. Justice for all living beings. It's talking about a true freedom movement. A lot of people talk about how it's all about freedom, but they find that a lot of people speak about freedom for themselves, freedom for their group, but not freedom for all. We don't really have a freedom movement. We have a my freedom movement. We have a freedom along the lines of people that I care about. But what I'm talking about is freedom for all. Agape, universal love, compassion towards all beings, treating people equally. That's the concept of social justice that I used to have. But one thing that I've learned is that the concept of social justice that a lot of people have is the concept of group justice. The concept that you were to judge someone not as an individual, not to look at them and say that you were responsible for your actions, but to look at them and say that you are responsible for the actions of your group. You were responsible for the things that your ancestors have done. Therefore, you, as a white person, are now responsible for all the horrible things that the white people did to the black people. And you, as a black person, are also responsible for all the horrible things that your ancestors have done to the white people, not forgetting that slavery was something that was ubiquitous throughout the ancient world. Black people had slaves just like white people had slaves. And if you have a look at society, and you go back far enough, we are all complicit in the worst atrocities. When I say we, in terms of this group mentality. And I find that when you go deeply into group justice, you realize that you have absolute chaos. You realize that now you can look at someone and not judge them based off of the content of their character, not by the color of their skin, or rather, you can judge them by the color of their skin, which is definitely not what Martin Luther King wanted. Martin Luther King was someone that advocated for equality, advocated for a society where we all work together as one. Forget about race. Forget about this concept of group justice. And realize that black supremacy is just as bad as white supremacy. And I want to talk about the topic of racism because I feel that racism is one of the effects of having this group justice mentality. People start looking at each other as a race, not looking at them as individuals. Start discriminating. And I want to be very clear about this. I know this is going to upset a lot of people, but here's the thing. You ready for it? You ready for this one? Here's the truth of the matter. From the perspective of freedom, from the perspective of truth, from the perspective of universal justice. There is nothing inherently wrong with racism. That's right, I said that. Having said that, it's douchey, it's distasteful, it's annoying. If someone doesn't like you because of the color of their skin, if someone discriminates against you because you look a particular way, they don't want to have a relationship with you because they've made these conclusions about the kind of person you are, that's their right to do so. And when I say they're right, I'm talking about this from the perspective of justice, from the perspective that you have a right to do anything that you want, provided you are not harming anyone in the process directly. And when I talk about racism, it's something that ubiquitously we all agree is not cool. It's what I would call aesthetically immoral. And when I say that, it's along the lines of not a very pleasant thing to do. Along the lines of someone that says they don't like you because you're a douchebag for no other reason because they think that your race is inferior. Or someone that says, I'm not going to go on a date with you because you are a faggot. It's distasteful. It's not cool. However, they have a right to say things like that. And the thing is, we've adopted this idea that racism is uncool. True. But what we are not, or what we should not do, is be willing to punish people because they show these attributes. Now, granted, I think socially it's incumbent upon us to put pressure on people to change their ways without violating their rights. Therefore, not encourage this kind of behavior. But I feel like it's important for me to preface this idea that whereas I am very much against the idea of racism as far as not liking it for my own personal aesthetics, people very much have a right to behave this way if they want to. They're not violating anyone's rights. Now, having said that, it's not a really cool thing, is it? The reason that we get so disgusted by it is because I think deep down we all realize the interconnected nature of things and the fact that if we are going to discriminate against someone based off of something that they don't have the power to control, it's kind of stupid. And deep down, when you look at things, when you realize that we're all connected, I mean, from a genealogical level, if you go back far enough, when you understand the origins of humanity, you can trace back human origins to pretty much the same race. That's what modern day science is telling us for the most part. And whether or not that is true, ultimately we all come from the one source. Whether that is on a scientific level, if you believe in the idea of the Big Bang, essentially we are all coming from one single source, or whether or not you believe in this from a spiritual context, that ultimately all there is a manifestation of the universe, the one, uni, and versare, change, the one change that is constantly changing and growing into this beautiful stream of potentiality. You'll have to excuse my creative license there. But I want to talk about the topic of racism a little more. I find more often than not that the most racist people that I experience are not the minority, are not the black people, are not the... Well, look, let's speak about black people here specifically, because I find more often than not they're the ones that want to talk about racism, and without a doubt there is a tremendous amount of racism that takes place in the world, and it's not cool, particularly when it deals with people that are making the decision to enact violence on you, therefore to take away your personal liberties, to arrest you based off of the color of your skin. That's something which is not acceptable. That's a racism that requires, well, that is contingent on someone violating your rights. If someone wants to frisk you, someone wants to incarcerate you purely because they think you might be more likely to be a terrorist, well, that's not cool. However, if someone wants to discriminate against you purely because, discriminate against you rather, along the lines of wanting to date you, that's another thing entirely. I think you understand what I'm trying to say here. But black people, more often than not, I find they've adopted this attitude that it is acceptable to behave like douchebags to people that are white, to be more racist towards white people because they see the actions of white people, or the actions of one individual, being contingent off of the things that their ancestors have done. And to explain that succinctly, more often than not, I find, at least from my experience, the Africans are more inclined to adopt this attitude that, you know what, you as an individual, you're responsible for all the shitty things that your ancestors have done, therefore I'm going to be a douchebag towards you. More often than not, I find that a lot of my African friends take on this attitude that it's okay to say things like, you know what, black people, we are beautiful, we are like gods. But the white people, look at all the things they have done. And the disconcerting thing I find is that, at least within the society that I am currently immersed in, this is within Australia, Melbourne, that when a black person is being racist, it is far more acceptable. More often than not, I will see white people coming to the defense of black people when they are being discriminated against. More often than not, someone will even just drop the word nigger, and I'll have one of my social justice warrior friends saying, "You can't say something like that. What are you doing saying? What are you doing calling him a nigger? That's totally unacceptable behavior. How dare you do something like that? Oh my God, this is so wrong." And deep down, I really don't care, because quite frankly, I don't care about racism. As long as someone is not violating my rights, someone can do what the hell they want to do. But when it comes down to black people and their behavior, I have found that some of the things that black people often say are disgusting and are racist. I'm going to call you up on this bullshit, because one of the things that I hate is this idea that it is okay to be racist because you're in the minority. A lot of black people perpetuated this idea that you cannot be racist if you were a black person. They have changed the definition of the word racism, which is ridiculous. I mean, a lot of people buy into this idea that the definition of a word is based off of how many people accept it, which is a chaotic, ridiculous notion, because now all that has to happen is we can take the word racism, which typically means discrimination towards someone based off of their race, generally in a negative way, and now change the definition to mean that if you were in a minority group, you cannot be racist. Some of the definitions I've heard African Americans use towards defining racism is completely ridiculous, and it makes them incapable of being racist, which is a ridiculous concept. The best way to define something is to use the original meaning. This is something that I talk about a lot. Otherwise, we just get chaos. And if the word changes, change the word. Change the actual word. But if we're going to have this system where we constantly redefine things over and over again, and I have one concept of what a word means, like with social justice, as I showed earlier, then there is never going to be any clarity. And the whole purpose of communication is to have clarity, to communicate your ideas effectively. And the problem I find is that black people, because they have this idea that they cannot be racist, and when I say this, of course, I am generalizing some black people within the community, because they endorse this idea, they often say things like black people are gods and white people are not. They often say things like it's inappropriate or it is wrong for a white person to discriminate against a black person, but it's not wrong for a black person to discriminate against a white person. And you get these ridiculous notions like cultural appropriation. And I've seen intelligent black women make the most ridiculous arguments along the lines of universal ethics. And when I say this, I try to be very, very clear because a lot of people make arguments along the lines of social justice, which is just chaotic. It is completely subjective, and you cannot have any universal system when you make arguments like, if I feel offended, then what you've done is wrong and you should be punished. If you call me something that I consider to be not my sexuality, then I'm going to be offended and you're going to be locked up in jail. People make arguments that, you know what, I'm going to give you guys an example of what I'm talking about over here. I came across a video of a black woman talking about how it's wrong for white people to imitate black culture. Let me have her explain it in her own words over here. Let's check this out.
They say imitation is the highest form of flattery.
It
what
is.
happens when it's not so flattering? The more you learn about the world and the people in it, you quickly realize just how beautiful and diverse it is. So where's the line between cultural exchange, appreciation, and appropriation? And why does it even matter? Here are 7 myths about cultural appropriation debunked. You're just looking for something to be offended by. It's just clothing, hairstyles, decorations, whatever. Don't you have something better to worry about? Okay, first off, it's possible to care about more than one issue at a time. The main problem with cultural appropriation comes from dominant groups borrowing from marginalized groups who face oppression or have been stigmatized for their cultural practices.
So you're saying that it's somehow wrong for me to borrow fashion ideas, to wear my hair in a particular way because you're in a minority group? Now, am I the only one that is screaming inside from this concept? Now, because you're in a minority, it's somehow unethical for me to use your fashion. Well, here's the thing. I understand that you may be offended by that, but you can get as offended as you want. That's irrelevant. I'm not doing anything that is violating your rights here. You don't own some kind of copyright to this kind of fashion just because your people, at least for the last few thousand years, have been identified by wearing this kind of fashion or braiding their hair in a particular way. Now, look, we're all going to get offended for various reasons. That's a very subjective thing. But you have absolutely no right to prevent me from wearing this kind of stuff. So for all you white guys out there that want to wear cornrows, I invite you to do so. And I invite you to freaking call these people racist, intolerant douchebags if they happen to be black and somehow believe that you can't wear this stuff just because you are white. That is the very definition of racism, or at least an example of it.
Throughout history, like cornrows. I mean, anyone can wear their hair in cornrows, but black people still face stigmas for wearing them, along with perfectly natural hairstyles like braids and locks. There are even companies and schools that prohibit these natural hairstyles. People have actually been fired for wearing braids.
Well, here's the thing. There's a distinction here, because whereas if you wear something to school, you wear something to work, now your organization can have any requirements it wants to. Now, if you consent to this stuff, if you consent to work in a place where they require you to wear your hair in a particular way, and you're willing to be paid to abide by these rules, then there's nothing wrong here. It's consensual, and this is understandable. Obviously, within a workplace environment, they require you to be professional, and if they have this subjective idea that wearing braids is not professional, well, you know what? They have a right to that. It may be stupid, and I would frankly argue that some of these ideas are stupid. If I want to wear my hair in braids, well, culturally, that's cool. That's professional to me. But you know what? If you, within your organization, want to say that I have to wear my hair a particular way, I have to cut my hair, hell, if you're saying that I have to freaking shave my ass, for crying out loud, well, if I consent to that, that's understandable. It's very different to me being outside of a corporate environment, or even a school for that matter. If I'm consenting to go to a school, I'm consenting to abide by the rules within that school, once again. But if outside of that environment I make the decision that I want to wear my hair in a particular way, then of course I should not be punished for that. Of course, it would be wrong for you to imprison me if I decided to wear my hair in a particular way, regardless of whether or not I was black or white. And that's the distinction.
Meanwhile, fashion models and celebs like Kylie Jenner get praised for wearing cornrows. And that's the main point. One group is being penalized by institutions for wearing natural hairstyles,
God.
while the other is called edgy and stylish for doing the exact same.
Well, of course, because one is within the area of hip-hop fashion, of Hollywood, which black people tend to dominate in, by the way. And the whole idea is that you are trying to be as edgy as you possibly can be. Therefore, of course, white people are going to adopt all of the cool fashion trends that are found within the black community, because the reality of the situation is black people tend to be, well, ostensibly the leaders of edgy fashion, particularly within the world of MTV and this bling bling pop a cap in your ass culture. Anyway, you get the idea. I could go on with her silly logic, but essentially she's saying that it is somehow offensive, which is understandable. I mean, people can get offended for many things. People can get offended that I'm making this video. In fact, there will be a lot of black people out there that are saying, how dare you?
How dare you make a video like this? It is very wrong. You are not a real black person for making a video. You racist black man.
Well, here's the thing. I don't really care. Yes, people are going to get offended. However, people do not have a right to prevent you from wearing things and from adopting their fashion. You know what? I like it. To me, there is nothing cooler than a white person imitating black fashion. Imitation, what do they say, is the best form of flattery? There's nothing cool than when I come across a white person and he starts acting like an African American. He's like, yo, what's up, my man? Yeah. Yo, want me to freestyle for you right now? Yeah, want me to drop it like it's hot? I love that shit. To me, it's cool because ultimately they want to impress you. And ultimately, your culture is appealing to them. But look, I think you guys get the idea. But the other thing I wanted to discuss is just the whole concept of social justice. And I kind of touched on this earlier. If you are the kind of person that believes that it is acceptable to do anything that you want because you believe it can lead to the greatest amount of good, you have to realize that you're dealing in subjectivity. That, fair enough, we have different values. You're willing to compromise anything. There is no limitation to what you will compromise, because ultimately, if you can conceive that it is going to lead to the greatest amount of good, what you have to realize is that you can become a victim of that. If within this group mentality, people believe that by killing you, by taking away your wealth, by taking away whatever belongs to you, will lead to the most amount of good, it is acceptable. Therefore, anyone can violate you. You are basically a sacrificial lamb towards this arbitrary idea of what will lead to the greatest amount of good. Therefore, you cannot have universal justice. And whereas something like that can work to your favor, particularly if you were in the minority, you can say things like, well, you need to pay reparations. Your race needs to pay reparations to my race, because you as an individual are responsible for the actions of your race. And that aside, by you doing so, it will lead to a better community. It will lead to more good for the entire nation or the entire world. You need to realize that if that applied to you as an individual, you may not be as willing to do that. Would you be willing to sacrifice your life, your money, your time, your friends, purely because the government, purely because someone believes that it will lead to the greatest amount of good? Well, I would argue you probably would not be willing to do so. The reason this concept of utilitarian justice, of social justice, is so appealing to the minority is because the majority of people, at least within Africa, Asia, and even in the Western world, are within the minority. I mean, granted, within the Western world, most people are within the top 1%. If you have a look at this in a larger context, I mean, there are generally people of less wealth than there are those with more wealth. Therefore, because they are in the minority, they are by far more willing to take away the rights of people that have more. The mentality is that the haves always have too much. Therefore, it's justified to sacrifice what they have for the greatest amount of good. But of course, when you reverse this thing, clearly you would not want that done, and clearly you would not be willing to sacrifice your time, your energy, your life for the greatest amount of good. And that's the problem with this whole system. It's not universal. If you accept the idea of what I would call freedom, of liberty, then you realize that it is never acceptable to do these things. It's never acceptable to have group justice, to have a society where it's okay to violate the rights, to violate their freedom for the greatest amount of good. You're trying to have a system that is fair, that is universally acceptable. Therefore, if it is wrong for you to do something, it is wrong for everyone to do that thing. That is the only way you have justice. That is the idea of justice. It's not about social justice. Anytime you put a modifier in front of a word like that, you're getting a different meaning. There is only justice. When you have social justice, you are obfuscating the whole idea of justice, which is all about equality, which is all about the concept of not only Black Lives Mattering, and of course I understand what that means, that there is a tremendous amount of injustice towards black people, just like there's a tremendous amount of injustice towards animals, just like there's a tremendous amount of justice towards other minorities. But we have to bear in mind here that we are talking about justice, period. And if you want true justice, then you have to not only think about what is in the interests of your friends or interests of the greater good, but is just, it is fair. End of story. And I feel like this whole concept of social justice is very, very, very relevant in this day and age, because we're moving into a world that is more focused off of making people happy, all about feelings, all about getting reparations for my race, my people. People identify with their culture. I recently had this experience not long ago where I met a black man, and a black African, and he was bold enough when I told him my name, which is Krishna, which is not a common name if you were from West Africa. He was bold enough to tell me that that was not a black name, understandably, but went on further to say that I don't know who I am. Went on to say that once I explained to him where I was from and what my other name was, that as a black person, I should use my black name, and that because I had adopted this other name that was representative of another people, of India, which I am actually very proud of. I think is a very beautiful name. It, strangely enough, means black or dark in Indian Sanskrit. The word Krishna, but it's also the name of one of the main deities, Lord Krishna. But went on to say that I don't understand anything about my culture because I did not use that name, because my father had made the distinct definition, the distinct decision to give me the name of a beautiful deity in the Indian tradition and not use my African name. Now, somehow to him, that was a understanding that I don't appreciate my black culture and I don't know who I am as a person. And his whole identity as to who he was based off of his culture. We got into this long discussion in regards to who we are as people, who we are as individuals. And his whole concept of who he was based off of his race. And this is something that I find very common within not just the black community, but within a lot of communities. People want to identify themselves by their race. In fact, from my culture, your name is a representation of not only what day you were born, but the kind of culture, your tribe. It says a lot about you as a person. People can identify a lot about you based off of the name that you use. And as an individual, I don't like that idea. I would like my name to be as descriptive, to be a representation of not what race I'm about, but my values. I think the Vedic teachings of Krishna are a beautiful manifestation of what I believe in, about justice, truth, and all the teachings that are manifest within the Vedic tradition. But that aside, it was disconcerting for me to realize that so many people identify themselves based off of their group, their culture. And it's important to know your history, to know your culture. But the circumstances of your birth are irrelevant. It's what you do with your life that determines who you are. People should not be focused so much off of their ancestry, what their fathers did, what their forefathers did. They should be focused on the kind of people they want to be. To start looking at what they want to achieve in life and not basing that off of what their ancestors have achieved. I mean, the only purpose of history is to give you a perspective ultimately, where you're going is by far more important. And when people start identifying themselves based off of their group and start making moral judgments on people based off of their culture, their race, that is a very dangerous, dangerous route to take. It's what has led to so many of the injustices in the world. In the Second World War, Hitler believing that the Jews were economically strangling the community. They were responsible for destroying the purity of the Aryan race. This whole group mentality, this whole idea of eugenics, of trying to make the perfect race, not looking at people based off of the content of their character, based off of their individual traits, or basing them off of the ancestry, basing them off of their phylogenetic programming. And it's just something that I would invite you all to think about. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, freaks and geeks, I think I've spoken long enough about race and cultural appropriation and social justice. And I want to speak a little bit about my music. I just want to end this podcast by saying I just released an EP. I'm very proud to announce it's called Going Thunder. In case you're not aware, my passion is music. That is the thing that I do, that I love to be involved in. And I would love you, if you have not done so already, to check out my music video, Going Thunder, to check out the EP. It's on Spotify. In fact, you can check it out. Let me just get the EP up over here. Come on, Spotify, don't fail me over here. Anyway, you guys can check this out by typing in Chris Schul over here. Going Thunder. It is out now. Be sure to support me. First and foremost, I like to think of myself as a musician. And I think one of the beautiful things about music is it's a powerful way of inspiring people. I think often music conveys the truth better than words do. I think words, as I've explained, often have the tendency to create unclarity. People have different interpretations, but without a doubt, music is tangible. People feel it on a visceral, palpable level. They know what you're trying to convey. And as a result, I think music is a powerful way to make change in this world. So, ladies and gentlemen, hope you get a chance to check out my EP, Going Thunder, and the music video out on YouTube. But until next time, this is Chris Schul. Peace out, keep it real, don't drive in text. Ow! Oh, yeah.
Yes, I. This song is called Be the Change. Inspired by the words of Mahatma Gandhi, who lived for peace and not violence, and told us to be the change we wish to see in the world.